While the PS1 is commonly associated with having the best RPG library of any Sony console, it's worth pointing out that the selection of role-playing games on the PS2 is nothing to scoff at. After going back and taking a look at the best RPGs on the PS1, we got a request to do the same with the PlayStation 2, and revisiting many of the console's greatest role-playing experiences was a worthwhile trip down memory lane that only served to underscore how much the genre thrived during the 6th generation. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at 15 of the best RPGs on the PS2. Sure, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance can be described as a bit of a Diablo clone, but it also happens to be the best console Dungeons & Dragons game for its time. While PC players were privy to classics such as BioWare's Baldur's Gate and its sequel, as well as Icewind Dale, Planescape Torment, and Neverwinter Nights, console players were largely left out of the D&D video game gold rush until Dark Alliance's arrival. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance delivers the great story and atmosphere that you'd expect from a D&D campaign, but it does so while also incorporating some incredibly satisfying hack-and-slash ARPG combat and distinct classes that make each playthrough a blast, especially when playing in local co-op with a friend. As far as two-player PS2 RPGs go, it doesn't get much better than Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. While it doesn't quite reach the same heights as Star Ocean: The Second Story, which coincidentally is one of my personal favorite RPGs, Star Ocean Till the End of Time is a commendable follow-up that more than deserves its flowers. The initial release of the game was plagued with a litany of bugs and performance issues, all of which would ultimately be ironed out in time for the game's Western release as Star Ocean Till the End of Time Director's Cut. It also represents a bit of a bittersweet swan song for the Star Ocean series' golden era, before it took a sharp left turn into mediocrity, which makes going back and playing Till the End of Time all the more necessary to see what a great game it truly is. That is, once you get past the overly long and drawn-out intro sequence. Probably my personal favorite action RPG on the PS2, X-Men Legends 2 Rise of Apocalypse is a major improvement over its predecessor in nearly every way. Aside from the refinements to combat, progression, and level design, X-Men Legends 2 lets players finally live out their dream of teaming up the X-Men with their classic rogues gallery, resulting in a roster of playable characters that outshines the original by a country mile. While Raven Software would go on to expand on this formula with Marvel Ultimate Alliance and its sequel, which admittedly I also love, X-Men Legends 2 is the developer's peak as far as comic-themed ARPGs go. Truth be told, I debated whether to include the first Dark Cloud or its sequel on this list of best PS2 RPGs, which says a lot about both games' quality. Ultimately though, Dark Cloud 2 won out thanks to its improved visuals, worthwhile enhancements to the original city builder and RPG gameplay hybrid, and major improvements to combat, including two protagonists who each have their own unique weapons, combat style, and progression path. The best part about Dark Cloud 2 is the ability to see the fruits of your city-building labors by witnessing the future impact of your present decisions. And, lest we forget, Dark Cloud 2 happens to have one of the best fishing minigames in a genre that is absolutely packed to the gills with them. Ask any fan of the Wild Arms series to nail down a favorite, and most players seem to oscillate between the tradition of the first game in the series, which of course is one of the PS1's best RPGs, and the innovations of Wild Arms 3. The stark deviations from its two predecessors also happens to result in Wild Arms 3 being one of the series' most contentious entries, but in hindsight, it's a much better game than its detractors might let on. While the game does lean a little bit too heavily on its exploration and dungeon crawling, combat is an area where Wild Arms 3 takes its crown as one of the best games in the series, incorporating 4 characters each wielding a legendary arm who, together, comprise one of the all-time great RPG parties in this epic Wild West-themed adventure. One of Square's greatest contributions to gaming during the 6th generation is Kingdom Hearts, which would eventually go on to inspire its own massive franchise within the Square Enix library. That first game, though, is still arguably the best, brilliantly mixing Tetsuya Nomura's skill for character design, storytelling, and world building with the unmistakably iconic worlds and characters from a slew of Disney properties. While Kingdom Hearts 2 does arguably feature a better selection of worlds and a much more streamlined approach to the gummy ship sections, it's hard to beat the impact that the first Kingdom Hearts had. Plus, any game that lets you fight Hades from Disney's Hercules and Final Fantasy VII's Sephiroth in the same arena is a winner in my book. Most longtime Dragon Quest fans point to Dragon Quest VIII as one of their favorite entries in the series, and it's easy to see why. Following the overly long and drawn-out Dragon Quest VII on PS1, Dragon Quest VIII feels relatively brisk in comparison, even at 60 to 70 hours for just the main quest. Part of Dragon Quest VIII's brilliance rests on Level 5's development, who happen to be responsible for several other games on this list, and do a commendable job tackling the iconic vibe and atmosphere of the classic Dragon Quest series. And while Dragon Quest VIII incorporates some elements that bring it into the modern era of JRPGs, such as a fully integrated 3D world and some speedier combat, it's still a classic Dragon Quest game at its core, solidifying itself as one of the PS2's great comfort food RPGs. There's a strong possibility that Shadow Hearts Covenant might be the best PS2 RPG that you've never played. Far lesser known than many of the other great RPGs in the PS2 library, Shadow Hearts Covenant is a unique experience that leverages fairly standard JRPG gameplay with a very compelling World War I era story that involves cosmic horror and Lovecraftian motif. But that's not to say Shadow Hearts Covenant's story is the only thing it has going for it. Far from it, in fact. The game's combat rests upon the Judgment Ring, which makes the random, turn-based encounters more engaging, thanks to a Super Mario RPG-style timing of button presses to enhance certain attacks. As one of the few horror-themed RPGs on the PS2, or any other console for that matter, Shadow Hearts Covenant stands out as one of the console's best and most unique experiences. Following the release of Xenogears, Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife Kaori Tanaka, now Soraya Saga, would unsuccessfully pitch a sequel to Square. Unhappy with the lack of support for their creative vision, the husband and wife duo would leave Square to start their own studio, Monolith Soft, with the team's first project being a 6-part spiritual successor to Xenogears, embodying similar themes and ideas. The first game in this planned hexalogy is Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Wille zur Macht, or The Will to Power, and it's every bit as dense and challenging as you'd expect a game named after Nietzsche's work to be. That said, it's also a great RPG that clearly lays the foundation for the studio's future greatness with the Xenoblade series, and it's also arguably the best entry of the 3 Xenosaga games before the series was inevitably and untimely cancelled. Following George Kamitani's work on the Sega Saturn classic Princess Crown, he would branch out to form his own studio with the now legendary Vanillaware, and Odin Sphere is its debut title. And man, what a debut it is. Odin Sphere is a sort of spiritual successor to Princess Crown, and much like Vanillaware's later work on Dragon's Crown, it blends elements of RPGs and beat-em-ups into a potent brew that's hard to put down. The hallmark of Vanillaware's games, their absolutely gorgeous hand-drawn visuals, are on full display in Odin Sphere, working overtime to bring characters and creatures from Norse mythology to life, all while delivering some of the best action RPG gameplay on the PS2. For the Final Fantasy series' 6th generation swan song, Square Enix would enlist the help of a team of franchise veterans, such as Final Fantasy VI and IX's Hiroyuki Ito, who also happens to be the creator of the Active Time Battle system, and Final Fantasy Tactics' Yasumi Matsuno, to craft one of the most exciting and forward-thinking entries in the series, resulting in Final Fantasy XII being wholly unique, even among other Final Fantasy games. Rather than rely on the series' traditional turn-based combat, battles in Final Fantasy XII play out as sort of automated, MMO-light encounters, where players can either manually target and attack enemies within range, or let their predetermined gambits play out. The gambit system allows players to get a sort of crash course in coding using if-then statements, and the amount of flexibility it affords in how you approach encounters is impressive. Of course, no Final Fantasy is just about its gameplay, and the story of Final Fantasy XII is, admittedly, the one area where the title doesn't quite meet the highs of its predecessors. While the return to Ivalice is an exciting prospect for fans of Final Fantasy Tactics, the disconnected feel to Final Fantasy XII's story results in many of its major plot points lacking the impact they might have had otherwise, even if the game's narrative is smartly written and features some mature and complex themes that are atypical for the series. Science fiction, bounty hunters, space pirates, a young, desert-dwelling nobody thrust into a heroic journey. You'd be forgiven for assuming Rogue Galaxy was an RPG version of Star Wars. But unfortunately, it never became the blockbuster it was so clearly designed and deserved to be. At the time of its release, Rogue Galaxy was developer Level 5's largest and most ambitious project to date, and it still stands as one of the now legendary studio's greatest works. Essentially, Rogue Galaxy is what you would get from blending Skies of Arcadia with Star Ocean, and its combat, storytelling, and progression systems are arguably better than either of the series it so clearly takes inspiration from. It's not hyperbole to assert that Rogue Galaxy is one of the PS2's greatest overlooked games, and it's as criminal as the crew of the Dorgan arc that more haven't played it. Getting a solid consensus from Tales of fans regarding their favorite entry in the series can be as difficult and contentious as the franchise is prolific, but it's a safe bet that, for many, Tales of the Abyss will land at or somewhere near the top. Tales of the Abyss is a classic Tales game, introducing players to an initially unlikable protagonist surrounded by an interesting and likable cast of characters, and then watching them grow into the hero they were always meant to be thanks to the relationships and bonds formed with their allies over the course of a grand adventure. Combat in Tales of the Abyss, which uses a modified version of the linear motion battle system similar to Tales of Symphonia, is some of the best in the series, and the game's story is surprisingly heartfelt and comforting, even if it occasionally plays it too close to genre convention. Choosing between Persona 3 and Persona 4 to include on a list of the best PS2 RPGs is a tough call to make, but the crown ultimately goes to Persona 4, thanks to Persona 3's definitive version arguably being the PSP re-release. Persona 4 is perhaps where the series really starts to come into its own, taking the radical reinvention of the spin-off series mechanics that came about in Persona 3 and further refining them into the compelling loop fans know and love today. The calendar system and social elements are practically perfectly balanced with the dungeon-crawling gameplay, which, thanks to Persona 4's TV world setting, features some of the most inventive and bizarre dungeon designs of any game in the series. Persona wouldn't really achieve mainstream success until Persona 5, but if you ask me, Persona 4 is still the series' peak. From both a story and gameplay perspective, Final Fantasy X is both one of the PS2's best RPGs and one of the greatest games in the Final Fantasy franchise. It follows what's arguably the most important trilogy of Final Fantasy games on the PS1, and somehow manages to meet, and in many ways surpass, those games' excellence to become one of the series' most iconic and heartfelt entries. The story of Yuna and Titus as star-crossed lovers working together to defend Spira from the all-encompassing destruction of Sin ranks among the best narratives in the series that's known for delivering some of the all-time greatest RPG storytelling, and its conclusion brings one of the most cathartic and emotional payoffs of any Final Fantasy game. But story is far from the only area where Final Fantasy X shines. The game's visuals and soundtrack are equally as impressive, with the former still holding claim to being some of the best on the PS2, and the latter ranking among legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu's best compositions. The introduction of the Sphere Grid is a unique approach to character progression that clearly lays the groundwork for the licenses of Final Fantasy XII and allows some flexibility in how players build out each character. And the optional endgame grind for obtaining all the Aeons ranks among one of gaming's greatest challenges. Simply put, Final Fantasy X is a masterpiece that embodies almost everything players love about the franchise and RPGs in general, and it's the face of the genre on the PS2. Having to narrow down the PS2's impressive RPG library to just 15 entries was harder than it might seem, and we're sure to have missed out on some other classics that would have otherwise made it onto a larger list. Let us know your thoughts on the PlayStation 2's greatest RPGs in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.